Significant developments continue along the first and second lines of defense within the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians continue offensive operations towards Hulyaipole from the northern flank, aligning the front line with the river line, and continue advancing to the east of the highway north of Hulyaipole as they capture additional fortifications and forest lines east of the highway, closing in on the settlements alongside it. At the same time, they captured the eastern forest lines to Dobropilya and continued advances within the town itself. In addition to this, advances south of Vedratne and east of Veliko Mikhailivka indicate new operations by the Russians on the northern bank of the Vovcha river line. In the direction of Veliko Mikhailivka, the Russians continue advances south of the Vovcha river line but into the forest patch area, which is connected through the river line to the eastern forest patch area, where the Russians, if they're able to push through and gain full control over the forest patch area, will be able to cut the supplies going to Alexandrorad, regaining control over the eastern bank of the Vovcha river line near the settlement, and it will allow them to start pushing towards Veliko Mikhailivka, as well as to the north alongside the fortifications south of Hevrilivka. Gaining control over the fortifications north of Veliko Mikhailivka and in the direction of Hevrilivka, the Russians will be able to gain control over the fortifications facing eastwards along the Vovcha river line towards the Russian possessions. The Russians are able to gain control over the fortifications and the settlements. They'll have the control over the crossing going over the Vovcha river line, and a significant force of the Russians will be able to push through into the Dnipropetrovsk region and in the direction of Pokrovsk, which is the northern supply hub in the vicinity of Hulyaipole. While it is separate from the front line itself from the Hulyaipole section, it is well connected with the highway, if Russians gain control over both Hulyaipole and Pokrovsk, as well as the highway leading in from the eastern flank. The Russians will have several supply lines leading to this section of the front line, both from the Donetsk city, the Donetsk region in general, and the Zaporizhia region, as well as the city of Mariupol, all connected to this section of the front line from several sectors and two logistical hubs under their control. And that is why this push up towards the forest patch areas as a new indication of offensive operations of the Russians towards the Vovcha river line, the northern bank of it, towards Veliko Mikhailivka and Hevrilivka, to gain control of the fortifications and the highway leading up to Pokrovsk from the east. At the same time, to the south of Pokrovsk and Alexandrivka, the Russians continue offensive operations, gain control over two fortifications south of Vedratne, where they managed to gain control of additional portions of the second line of defense, pushing in the direction of Ostapivsk and up towards Andrivka, where the Russians will continue offensive operations, gain control over the eastern bank of the Haichu river, and push onwards along the second line of defense here in the Dnipropetrovsk region and enter into the Zaporizhia region, just like their forces to the south. Where offensive operations continues within Dobropilya, where the Russians gain control over additional portions of the settlement and the forest lines to the east, completely securing the eastern flank of Dobropilya. With this, the Russians have full control over the Yansha river all the way up to the highway and the fortifications, where fighting is taking place along the Haichu river now. The Russians continue offensive operations along the forest lines to reach the highway, and fighting is now taking place along the fortifications here to the east of Varvarivka, as well as the river line here to the south. In addition to this, Russians aligned the first front line with the river line here to the north of Hulyaipole. The Russians continue putting pressure on the Ukrainian possessions near Hulyaipole. Speaking of Hulyaipole, the Ukrainians released a video where they said they struck some Russian forces and assault group towards Hulyaipole. However, Russian sources geolocated the footage to show it is actually from Tetkino in the Kursk region. We also see, based on the trees that are full of leaves and it's green and lush, that is not the weather in the end of November in the Hulyaipole direction. As to why the Ukrainians use archival footage to show some sort of victory, well, it is clear because the Russians continue advancing within this section of the front line, and they have been doing so non-stop, with almost 400 square kilometers captured here in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia region along the first and second lines of defense just this month of November. In the Pokrovsk and Mirnarod section of the front line, there are no developments this update. However, I deleted large portions of the fortifications along this section of the front line because 90% of the grouping of it was already captured by the Russians, and the last 10% was inaccurate. If we take a look at Playfrest's map, we can see that there is a lot of fortifications that I do not have on my own map, and I could not copy to it because Playfair has disabled it. So I'll be using his map when covering the fortifications in the area. And taking a quick update at it, we can see a lot more has been built since he last updated it, and the addition of it that I have. From this, we can see that the Ukrainians have built a lot of trenches and fortifications here to the north of Pokrovsk, from which there are a lot of fortifications and trenches here to the west of Pokrovsk, where fighting currently taking place south of Resigns. This includes some barbed wire lines, trenches, and anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth lines. What we see as the color code is that the red colors here are anti-tank ditches. The more purple-ish color, light pink color, is barbed wire. And then there is the third color, the light blue color here, which is dragon teeth lines. So what we're seeing is that the Ukrainians have made a new tactic here south of Dobropilya, where they built 3 lines of anti-tank ditches with a barbed wire line before it and after it. So the barbed wire is to prevent infantry from pushing through. They need armored vehicles to get rid of the barbed wire, to which they cannot proceed beyond it because of the anti-tank ditches. The infantry has to go to the front line with armored vehicles clearing the barbed wire, then the infantry dismount to fill up the holes for a pathway through the anti-tank ditches. They have to fill up 3 separate anti-tank ditches, which takes a lot of work and therefore a lot of time, before an armored vehicle can then clear through the second line of barbed wire, and then they can push through. This gives a lot of time for Ukrainian forces to respond directly with their own counterattack, and with FPV drones they'll be able to strike for several rounds before the Russians are able to push through. So this makes it complicated for the Russians to push through these defensive lines. However, the number of trenches and fortifications beyond these defensive lines are limited in comparison to the more prime locations of the fortifications and defenses the Ukrainians had prior to Pokrovsk. Beyond the city of Pokrovsk, it gradually declines, and to the north of Dobropilya, the next lines of defense are still being built. They are not well connected, and the trenches are barely existent. So based on this, we can see that the Russians, if they're able to push through from the northeastern flank, where they initially pushed through the fortifications and regain control over the locations here in the north, where they already control Shirova, Volodymyrivka, Pankivka, and Mayak. This map isn't properly updated. The Russians can then push through and bypass the fortifications in the direction of Dobropilya, clear the fortifications here near Novoshahova and Ivanivka, and then push up to Dobropilya, where they can bypass some of these fortifications here north of Pokrovsk by attacking from the eastern flank. So based on this, we can see that the Russians can push into towns such as Belitske, Doroshne, Shevchenko, and Chernyhivka, bypassing the fortifications. And then once they have control over these settlements, they'll be able to create safe crossings towards Dobropilya, gaining control over which, again, will allow them to create safe crossings across the next defensive line, and then push onwards towards Borova, which is the last line of defense of these anti-tank ditches and barbed wire lines, all the way up to the northwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. That means the Russians, if they are able to properly secure Pokrovsk and Leningrad quickly, will be able to push onwards towards the next lines of defense, following which the Ukrainians do not have properly prepared defensive lines and fortifications beyond it. That means what comes after Pokrovsk is really the final lines of defense of the Ukrainians within the Donetsk region. As for the previously updated section here near the Vovcha River line, if Russians are able to gain control over the roads crossing into the Dnipropetrovsk region, well then the Ukrainians do not have proper defensive lines prepared here either. In conclusion, if we take a look at the central parts of the Donetsk region and the frontline positions, the Russians are nearing the final lines of defense in the western outskirts of the Donetsk region and eastern outskirts of the Dnipropetrovsk region. If they're able to push through the current frontline positions, then they'll be able to bypass the main fortifications and defenses of the Ukrainians in the Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporizhia regions. As for the Kharkiv region, there are several additional lines of defense that have been built over the past years, which means even if the Russians are able to capture Kupiansk, there'll be no massive movement by the Russian forces because the Ukrainians simply have several lines of defense they can make use of. If the Russians are able to gain control over the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions in the south, they can completely bypass all of these positions and fortifications and instead push towards Poltava, Dnipro, and so on. And therefore, the Russians have absolutely no interest in storming Kharkiv directly head-on from the Belgorod section of the border, but instead will be doubling down on their frontline fighting in the Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia regions, and then bypass the Kharkiv region from the south. As for the Kostyantynivka direction, the Russians managed to gain control over the highway leading up to the city. With that, the Russians have control over an additional supply route leading into the city, both the highway here to the south leading to the city of Toretsk, and also the railway here to the southeast, where the Russians also have control over that. That means the one supply route into the city has now been expanded to 3, as we see with this geolocated footage confirming the Russian advance in the southern parts of Kostyantynivka. To the northeast of this, the Russians managed to gain control over several positions to the southwest of Siversk, including fortifications to the northeast of Sviatopokrovsk and some forest lines along the Revel line. With this, Russians are developing offensive operations towards the southern flank of Siversk and cutting off the highway leading into the town from the south. This leaves just the northwestern route that is quickly being attacked by the Russian forces as well. The Russians have control of Platonivka overlooking the highway, which means all of the roads leading into Siversk and the fortifications to the west of it have been cut off physically or by Russian fire control. This means the Ukrainian forces have to resupply their forces through the forest lines and the open fields, where at the end of November, these roads are not usable at all. Just a few drives and the ground turns completely muddy. This significantly limits the supplies going through the Siversk direction, and it's only a matter of time before the Russians gain control over Siversk and the surrounding fortifications due to the complications of the supply of the Ukrainian forces and the compromised fortifications to the east and south of the town. The Russians also managed to gain control over several fortifications along the Siversk forest area, where they're pushing in the direction of Borova and Ozerne. Russians have managed to gain full control over the highway from Liman all the way to the Siversk-Donetsk River, where a push by the Russian forces to connect their forces near Platonivka and push to gain control over Zakitne will allow the Russians to connect their forces with the Siversk section and the Liman section. Gaining control over Siversk and the highway will allow the Russian forces to have a direct connection from Siversk to Liman through the highway, and the supplies in the Liman section of the front line will be significantly improved. Therefore, the Russians will look to gain full control over Siversk and then start a push towards Liman from the southeast. This will require for the Russians to gain control over the Borova, Ozerne, the surrounding fortifications, the Siversky-Donetsk river line, and then the area surrounding Zakitne and Siversk for a connection between the two. To the north of this, the Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of Borova, penetrating the final line of defense east of the town, where the Russians have managed to gain full control over Briska and Rivka, and is now pushing towards the fortifications with a combined push from the north and the northeast. With this, the Russians continue offensive operations here east of the Usk River line, and is now working on isolating the area north of Borova and the area east of Borova, slowly pushing through to gain full control over the entire angle around Borova. And with the push on the rear of the fortifications, Russians will be developing offensive operations to gain control over the defensive lines here to the east of the town and along the Usk River line. A push from the north and the south will allow the Russians to cut off the supply fortifications east of Borova, and this will allow the Russians to achieve an operational encirclement of these frontline positions, operationally encircling a large grouping of Ukrainian forces in the area, where several mechanized brigades and territorial defense brigades operate along these settlements and fortifications here to the southeast of Borova. Finally, an honorable mention to Andrei Yeremak, who after 3 years and 9 months was fired/resigned after the Ukrainian anti-corruption raid on his home. So he's cutting ties, making sure that if he falls, well, Zelensky will not fall with him. So with this, a complete rehaul of the political situation in Ukraine, as Zelensky no longer has any of his original allies and constantly has to rotate out his staff due to corruption cases happening one after another. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.